Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation on the potential impacts of this coronavirus pandemic on U.S. Mexico trade. As you well know, the current public health crisis that we are facing has caught both countries and Canada, I may say, in the middle of the implementation of a new trade agreement, the USMCA, which was to replace NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. We also know that trade between the two countries has grown steadily and now reaches well over $600 billion a year. And it is also estimated that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs depend on binational trade directly and indirectly. So as authorities from both countries deal with the coronavirus pandemic, factories have shut down or slowed down their production. Borders are partially closed, and hundreds of workers, hundreds of thousands of workers perhaps, are going to lose their jobs or be furloughed for a while. We do not know yet what the overall effects of this pandemic will be on binational trade and certainly on jobs. We also do not know if these changes will be temporary and we will eventually pick up where we left off, or if more structural changes are afoot for binational trade. Although these things are difficult to know right now, we can certainly hold a conversation on how these countries, the US and Mexico, are responding to protect the economic ground and, of course, to prepare for a potential recovery past this pandemic. To discuss some of these issues that are already visible and those that we might face in the future, we are happy to host David Gantz, the Baker Institute's Will Clayton Fellow on Trade and International Economics. The dynamics will be as follows. David will speak for a while, 20-25 minutes. He will share some of his thoughts on this issue, and then he and I will engage in conversation. I have some questions of my own, and I have received some questions from some of you Baker Institute sponsors and people who participate in our forums. Hopefully this will be of use to you as citizens, as investors, and as companies as you prepare for the post-pandemic. So let me welcome David to talk to us for a little bit, and then I'll come back to engage him in conversation. David, the floor is yours.
Tony, thank you for the introduction, and welcome to all of our friends with the Center for the U.S. and Mexico and the Baker Institute. This is I think as Tony put it, a good time for a conversation because there are, needless to say, a great number of uncertainties in the process today, and separating the impacts of COVID-19 from some of the other economic impacts that are affecting U.S. Mexico Canada trade today are quite difficult, in part because, again, as Tony has mentioned, the USMCA is, at least in theory, scheduled to go into force July 1. Now, there's a lot of discussion about postponing it for 2 or 3 months. The auto industry and others have said we can't deal with all of this at once. But the fact is, that isn't just one of the several other major economic factors that is affecting U.S.-Mexico trade right now. And if you add to that the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which has caused a precipitous drop in petroleum prices, which is rather important for Mexico as well as the U.S., since both are major producers and exporters, the complications that are facing stakeholders of various kinds in all three countries right now are really quite substantial. So, and on top of all of that, we have an ongoing 2-year-old trade war between the US and China, which, among other things, is having major impacts on supply chains in North America as well. So what I'd like to do is, in the next 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, is to separate my remarks into 2 chunks. First of all, looking at short term, which is obviously a lot easier to predict than longer term, and then moving over to some of the longer term effects, because I agree fully with Tony that in some respects we may never be the same for benefit or not for benefit after this begins to clear away, whenever that happens. The most obvious factor we are seeing today with many millions of Americans and considerable numbers of Mexicans out of work, with factories shut down and the like, is people are buying less stuff. The American auto industry has been shut down for about 3 weeks. It's going to be shut down for at least another 3 weeks. So nobody's making cars at the moment in the United States, which means, given the just-in-time auto parts facilitation process, nobody's buying a lot of new auto parts right now. And the dealerships in the US where they're allowed to be open are essentially vacant. Plus, Americans in most parts of the country have been told to stay as home. So we're not going to department stores. We're not going to auto dealerships. We're not buying washing machines. We're not going to restaurants. So the consumption levels in the US, which of course drive the economy here, as in Mexico, have gone way, way down. And they're going to be staying down, I would guess, at least through the end of May, and maybe in some places longer. We don't know how quickly there will be a resumption of normal activity, but it's obviously going to be a while. And if you add not other products that are made in Mexico for the US market to autos and auto parts and washing machines, you're talking about a huge volume of goods. You know, keep in mind, as we know, about 75% of Mexico's total exports go to the US every year. More interestingly, for at least the last 6 or 8 months, Mexico has been America's largest source of imported goods, eclipsing China. So we're talking about a huge impact when we talk about U.S.-Mexico trade, a huge impact on both countries. And the products that Mexico sends to the U.S., in addition to the ones I mentioned, are some of what I consider the basics of life, which are footwear and apparel and television sets. All of those are major project areas among thousands of others. In addition, Mexico, of course, is a major supplier of food, including a lot of food that typically goes to restaurants, not just to supermarkets. That particular volume obviously is substantially down in many parts of the United States. We are, since the oil market is a world oil market, consumption in the US and consumption in the rest of the world is an important factor. We make a lot of gasoline out of Mexican oil, for example. Americans are driving much, much less. Airplanes are flying much, much less. Some airlines are down by about 80%. Auto travel is down in most parts of the country by more than 50%. A further decline in petroleum products for consumption, a further decline in production of petroleum products obviously affects Mexico, although of course it affects the United States as the world's largest oil producer at least as much or more. As Tony mentioned, the border has been closed to non-commercial traffic, as has the US-Canada border. Tourism is Mexico's third largest source of income. It's about 9% of the GDP. And basically, tourism has slowed to a trickle. And even if the López Obrador regime allows flights to come in from Europe and Asia, the volume is down to much less than what it was a few months ago. And of course, the ripple effect is enormous. Hotels, guided tours, restaurant patronage will all be severely curtailed in places like Mexico City and Cancun and other tourist hotspots. The cruise ship industry is almost entirely moribund. Nobody is taking cruises these days, and since quite a few cruise ships typically call at the Atlantic and Pacific ports in Mexico, that's another hit as well. But looking at a more focused picture, I'm currently in Tucson. I'm 60 miles from the Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora border. Nogales, Arizona store traffic is down 80% in the last month. Tucson, Arizona gets about $1 billion worth of goods and services sales from Mexican visitors, and that has mostly disappeared as well. Obviously, the there are many Mexicans who visit the U.S. frequently, not only in Tucson, and we have those issues as well. And we don't know how long it's going to last. There are merchants in Nogales, Arizona, who probably will not survive over the next couple of months because most of them just aren't that well financed. Business people are still traveling. Commercial traffic is still going back and forth. But even with business travel, I think there has been a reduction, mostly because people are concerned about getting on airplanes. The costs of dealing with all of this, of course, are staggering. We had about a $2.2 trillion worth package that was passed by the U.S. Congress a few weeks ago. I don't know what the numbers are in terms of the costs that are projected for Mexico these days, but clearly it is going to go up, and there will be a huge strain on the healthcare system as well as on the economy in Mexico, directly resulting from the coronavirus, just as there is in New York and the state of Washington and California and many other hotspots here. The problem isn't going away because it's been addressed later than it should have been. We have some experience with that in the United States. But obviously the human costs are enormous. One of the major concerns in the U.S. at the moment is the number of workers, particularly low-income hourly workers, that have been furloughed, particularly in the restaurant and some of the manufacturing industries. We have the same kind of a situation in Mexico, except to some extent it's worse because the informal economy is much larger percentage-wise in Mexico than it is in the U.S. And if you're somebody who is selling food from a truck on the street in Mexico City, it's pretty hard for you to stay home because if you do, you won't be able to buy any food. So you're in a serious problem in some respects, more so even than in the United States. Short term, I think it's pretty clear now that the USMCA, which is theoretically still supposed to come into effect July 1, is not going to do so. There will be an agreement among the three countries with strong pressure from private stakeholders to delay that probably for 2 or 3 months, just because of the challenges, particularly for autos, in dealing with new rules of origin, certificates of origin, and other changes that come about very quickly under the USMCA. So I think that will probably happen, although we don't know the details yet. In other areas, there may be a few more positive signs for Mexico. As most of you are aware, the Mexican peso US dollar relationship has fallen to about 26-1. With that kind of a de facto devaluation, Mexican goods being sent to the US that are mostly Mexican content are cheaper, and therefore that may help somewhat. Things like fruits and vegetables and tomatoes. Although on the other hand, anything that's manufactured with imports from outside Mexico will suffer because the imported parts and components are denominated in dollars. So that's a factor we can't really assess yet, but it will impact some businesses and some industries. One of the most potentially beneficial results of the approval of USMCA in all three countries was the assumption that the 3-year chill on business investment and employment would be lifted once it became clear that USMCA was going to go into force. And I still think that is true, but I don't think it's going to be lifted now. It's not going to be lifted until there is a better idea among many businesses as what the situation is going to be as a result of the virus. Is there going to be a long, deep recession in the US and therefore in Mexico and probably in the rest of the world? Or is this something where maybe by July or August, we'll start to see a significant improvement? If it happens in the US, it will help Mexico recover as well. How many businesses that are closed down today will open in 2 months? We just don't know. But I think you can be fairly sure that there will be a freeze on, or in many places, on new investment and new hiring in the business community. I mean, I'm at the University of Arizona. We were told last week we have a freeze on hiring here. We're all obviously operating on the internet in terms of giving our classes. So I think what you're seeing in this particular type of service industry here, and I assume the same at Rice University, is true of most other service and manufacturing businesses. Nobody is going to go out and expand when they don't know how soon it will be before things get back to something that we used to consider to be normal. And again, there are many restaurants in this town, as there are in Houston and most other cities. Some of them are better financed than others. Some of them will more likely recover than others. And then, of course, we have in the U.S. we have a number of bricks and mortar department stores like Sears and Penny and Macy's, which may or may not survive. In the longer term and medium term, I think the most significant factor is probably going to be the continuing shift in U.S. supply chains away from China. There is new pressure now in high-tech manufactured goods for security reasons, and the discovery a few weeks ago that about 80% of our raw materials for pharmaceuticals comes from China concerned a lot of people in the U.S., including many in Congress. China, the shift has been going on for some time now. It really began in some respects about 6 or 7 years ago as Chinese manufacturing costs and labor costs went up, and you started to see some movement back to Mexico and a lot of movement to places like Vietnam. For the last 2 years, you've had tariffs on $370 billion worth of Chinese goods, ranging from 7.5% to 25%, which I think at this point, since nobody really thinks those tariffs are going to be lifted in the foreseeable future, has convinced a lot of business people that China is no longer a great place to be sourcing parts and components. So you have a process which has been going on for some time, accelerated in the last year or two, and now is being accelerated again. I think more and more companies are coming to the effect that even if they source some of their goods from China, having a single source for critical parts and components is not a very smart idea anymore. And I think you're going to see, regardless of what else happens, you're going to see a lot of diversification of parts and components, not only in autos and pharmaceuticals, but in high tech, but probably quite a number of other industries as well. Will these companies relocate to Mexico? I think in many cases, probably that is the place to relocate of choice. With certain high tech parts and components, it may well be that it all becomes resourced and comes to the US. But if you think about it, there really isn't much reason why Canada, Mexico, and the US could be treated together in terms of products that raise national security issues, because there really never has been much of an issue there in the past. So what does all this mean? As far as I can guess, and that's really what it is, guess, is that some of the resourcing or some of the supply changes will continue to go to other places in Asia, like Vietnam, to the extent Vietnam can absorb them. But there's a golden opportunity over the next year or two, in particular, for much of this supply chain shifting to go to Mexico. As we all know, there are all sorts of advantages, language, geography, transportation, and the like, that make Mexico such an ideal place to produce goods for the United States. All of these factors, I think, should combine to make it more likely. Among other things, in the auto industry, as many are aware, the North American content has to go from 62.5% to 75% after 3 years. And if you're going to move some auto parts from, say, China or Vietnam to the US, Mexico's a logical place. Obviously, there's a caveat here, and that is you have to assume that AMLO is not going to scare investors away with anti-business, anti-investment policies. It assumes that the COVID-19 will not extend for a very long period in Mexico to disrupt business and people's lives. And it assumes that at some point there will be a better effort to deal with corruption and drug violence. But all of those things, I think, probably could be achieved under the right circumstances. And I think but the problems are there. We all remember the termination of the Mexico City airport project 15 months ago. Some of you may not have heard about the termination of a Corona brewery in Mexicali a couple of weeks ago. One, I think, can very easily argue about whether it was a really good idea to put a brewery in a place like Mexicali, where there's a terrible shortage of water. But at the same time, doing this by popular referendum, so-called, probably doesn't do much to build investor investor confidence. So it's really hard to know whether Mexico will benefit entirely from what they should, in my opinion, from this supply chain readjustments, or whether it will be less than it might be otherwise if Mexican government policies were a little bit more business friendly. But I think, again, in many of these areas, there just really isn't any good alternative. As I said before, the benefits that we might anticipate from the USMCA have been delayed somewhat, although presumably they will come eventually, maybe 3 or 4 or 6 months or a year late. In all of these respects, it's hard to look at the auto industry and to say they will be better off in the US because they're making more cars in the US if nobody's buying the cars and if the cars are more expensive because of the new rules of origin. But we don't know yet how the impact will be. What is perhaps more important generally for Mexican exports to the US in particular is how long it will take consumer confidence to recover once the coronavirus is under control. And in many respects, it's not going to be under control until we have a vaccine, which could be easily a year or more. But if you look back at 2008 and 2009, it took consumers quite a while to get back in the habit of buying lots and lots of stuff that they may or may not really have needed. So if you're looking at what is going to happen here, which is probably going to be a much deeper recession than 2008 in area in the US at least, it could be 2, 3, 4 years before the auto industry and a lot of other consumer selling groups get back to where they were 3 or 4 or 5 months ago. We just don't know. How quickly will tourism and business travel recover? Again, it's a bit of an uncertainty. I think that Mexico is such a popular tourist destination for Americans that as soon as Americans feel safe to do so, they will start going back to Mexico. I think it seems to me that's clear. How rapidly that'll happen, it's hard to say. It depends on how scared people have been with the virus. You have business travel impacts. There was more of an impact after 2007, 2008 than for tourism, mostly because some business groups figured out that they could save a lot of money by doing more online. And goodness knows, one thing, if we're learning anything at the moment, is that this is how Zoom works, this is how Skype works, and sometimes you can do things that way rather than having to travel. I don't think business travel will ever disappear entirely, but it could be chilled for a period of several years or so. The area which is going to expand most, it seems to me, is internet sales of services and goods. Amazon.com and Walmart online and that kind of thing, I think, are going to do very well, and bricks and mortar stores are going to suffer. From our point of view in the educational industry, one has to wonder whether there will not be a much broader use of internet-based education, synchronous education, real time, than there has been in most major universities in the past, outside of some of the commercial ones, because it's simple in some respects, it's cheaper, even if for many students and many faculty, it really isn't very attractive. So will more Mexican students who might in the past have come to the US go to the US, study in the US via the internet? I don't know, but I think there's a real possibility that we're going to see some changes in this area, or we might see some hybrid courses where instead of a Mexican student coming to the US for 4 years to the University of Arizona or to Rice University, they spend a couple of years or 3 semesters or something like that at Rice or the Arizona, and then they spend the rest of the time online. It's really one thing that I have learned, having spent a great deal of time teaching on the internet in the last 3 weeks, is that it's not wonderful, but it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. And I think with conscientious students and a good internet connection, you can do pretty well. Not the same as sitting in class, but it certainly is an option that will be attractive, it seems to me, in the future for more students looking for traditional education. So otherwise, just one or 2 points on the oil prices and investment. You have oil prices, Brent crude, down around, I didn't see it this morning, but around $30 or $32. It was down as low as 20 before. Mexican crude is quite heavy, so it's a much lower price yet. I don't think Mexico can produce oil at current prices. The US can't produce oil at current prices. Probably nobody can except Russia and Saudi Arabia. So this affects everybody who is an oil producer. And the question is this going to be resolved, let's say, in the next week or two? We thought it was last week, but didn't happen. How does this intersect with AMLO's policies, which give lots more control over petroleum production to Pemex, a company that doesn't have a great reputation for innovation or lack of corruption, and less to the private sector in a situation where Mexican oil production continues to decline significantly every year? We just don't know. Maybe some of these changes will encourage rethinking in Mexico of factors that affect oil trade, and perhaps they won't. So finally, just one point. I think one thing we're seeing both in the US and Mexico at the present time is somewhat increased willingness of governments to interfere with private sector activities. I think about the fussing that's been going on between the administration here and General Motors and 3M in the last week or two, and obviously a lot that has happened over the more than a year or so with the Mexican administration. Is this something we're going to see more of because of COVID-19, with the Defense Production Act being invoked but not being used very much yet in the U.S., and obviously some efforts in the U.S. to deal with, in Mexico to deal with the crisis as well. So it's really, I think that is an area where the future seems to me to be one that is more cloudy than in a lot of other areas as well. So I've spent a lot of time here, so I think I'll stop now and maybe we can take some questions.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your presentation. I think, as you well mentioned, a lot of things are uncertain. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that I sort of crafted before, and then we do have, I see on the margins of my computer screen that some questions are coming in. So I'll try to also pose some of those questions to you. The very first question is, do you think, I'm going to go back to one point that you made, which is Mr. Trump's style of dealing with trade. I guess in hindsight, it may have proven to be quite damaging, not just for all the uncertainty that is introducing into the trade environment and the supply chains and so on. Do you think that these trade wars that Mr. Trump has engaged in will now recede in the background? Will he double down? What's going to happen to all this going on before the pandemic?
In terms of speculation, which is what I'm doing, Mr. Trump has said several times over the last week or two that he has no intention of deferring any of the tariffs, the additional tariffs that have been imposed on China generally, and on steel and aluminum from almost everywhere in the world except Canada and Mexico. So at least up until now, even though it appears that he's under a lot of pressure from some of his advisors to give some American businesses who are hurting because of the virus and the other factors some relief from cash flow, since they're worried about cash flow, and since a tariff obviously is a tax on imports and most of those are paid by importers in the US, there is pressure for him to do this, but he hasn't done it yet. I don't see any real sign at all that he's planning to lift the phase 1 tariffs that were agreed with China in January 2020, although there are explicit exceptions that are being made on a regular basis, I guess, through the Treasury Department or the Customs Service. So so far, I don't think there has been much change. Now, the administration has been talking about 25% tariffs on autos and auto parts now for well over a year, and they've totally deferred any action there. And I think it's highly unlikely, given the state of the US auto industry, which includes many foreign-owned companies, that they would do anything on that in the foreseeable future. So I don't think that's either of those are very likely. So maybe some reductions here and there. There's an enormous amount of pressure to reduce tariffs on things like ventilators and personal protection equipment for hospital workers. And some of that seems to be going forward on a piece by piece basis. But I don't see any, even with all this crisis, see any broad indication at the top level of the administration that the president's love of tariffs has been diminished in the least.
Is there anything that companies and governments could have done better to prepare for something like this? What used to be a strength, for example, the just-in-time supply chains are now real weaknesses because companies are running out of inventories, parts, and so on. And so now we have a problem with the supply chains. Could they have perhaps found a middle ground? Are there any particular actions they could have taken to prevent this incredible slowdown in the supply chains and in trade?
I think as a result of all of this, not just the trade war, but the coronavirus, there is going to be a fundamental shift in supply chains, not just in the auto industry and production of that kind, but in almost every major industry. I think sole source dependence on China or anywhere else is going to be a thing of the past. I think in many respects, the just-in-time production is going to show that it has been more costly to business than it has been a benefit. And with all of the implications it has, for example, building warehouses, which a lot of companies have not had to do, because you simply cannot depend on sole source in one country, whether it's China or somewhere else. I mean, there are probably a number of American auto companies, particularly the European, the Volkswagen and BMW and Mercedes-Benz, who are dependent on supply chains that come from Europe. And those have been slowed down as well, not perhaps quite as much. If I were Fiat Chrysler, I'd be really, really worried. Maybe it's not as big a problem with the German companies as the other, but certainly an awful lot of business executives must have seen a sign of what might happen in the future. And I'm guessing that some of them will no longer simply say, well, we're going to buy the goods wherever we can get it at the lowest price and the best delivery. They're going to start looking at some of these other factors, because if you have to close down your factory for want of 10 or 15 parts for a month or 6 weeks or so, the costs are far greater than the cost would have been if you had a more diverse supply. But again, I think it's probably very industry specific as to how that works. In some cases, high tech, pharmaceuticals, U.S. business will be forced to do so by the Congress if they don't do it themselves. In others, like automobiles, it's mostly going to be the business decisions.
Yeah, I have another question from one of our viewers here. One hot issue in the Mexican press is oil and gas in the Zama field. This particular field, it may not be within our area of expertise. I mean, I think that we have a Center for Energy, and they may know a little bit more about this. But one issue is there, and this field is the process of unification in favor of a private company and Pemex. How do you see the oil and gas markets? We know that a lot of the gas that goes into Mexico comes from Texas. How do you see the gas industry in particular, and obviously the oil investment in Mexico panning out during and after this pandemic, of course?
I'm not sure the pandemic is as much of a factor here. And again, as you know, this is not my area of expertise. Mexico has been importing natural gas from the U.S. for 30 years. I can remember visiting maquilas in El Paso 20 years ago, and they're telling me that the gas prices in Ciudad Juarez were twice what they were in El Paso. Mexico has had a shortage for a long time. Some of it is because much of the gas was produced in the southeast and much of the need was in Monterrey in the northwest. But I think at the present time, pushing new investment in oil and gas in Mexico is probably a very difficult process, just because you can't make money producing it. Now, obviously, it's a long-term process. You were talking about 5, 6, 7 years. So it may well be that this particular field will go forward if the private investors feel comfortable working with Pemex under current situations where Pemex is the darling of the AMLO administration. I just don't, I think it's really hard to tell. I don't know what oil production per barrel overall is in Mexico, but I'm guessing it's around $30 a barrel, which is higher than the price for Mexican crude at the moment, and far higher, of course, than Saudi Arabia and somewhat higher than Russia, although it's lower than fracking in the United States. So I think one of the impacts between the price war in Middle East and Russia, plus the enormous reduction in demand from less driving and less airplane flying, not only in the US, but probably worldwide, is going to have a very negative effect on oil exploration over the next few years. They're expecting a number of smaller American producers either to go out of business or to be bought up by the big companies. And there are huge numbers of layoffs in Texas and lots of other places, even central Pennsylvania and North Dakota. It seems to me that even if there is a relatively quick recovery from the world recession, let's say by this time next year or late this year, it's going to take a lot longer for the oil industry to recover.
Yeah, I want to add something to that because I think it's important to know the Mexican oil industry is definitely in trouble. I think Pemex produces a barrel of oil for about $14 to $15 or so.
Oh, that's better than expected.
Which is not bad, but when the oil is $13 a barrel, then you're really operating in the red. So that in and of itself is quite complicated. And this geopolitical situation going on between Saudi Arabia and Russia is not going to help. And the other issue that I want to add to is the gas exports from Texas. I mean, obviously, there was a lot of complementarity between Texas and Mexico. Texas supplied the gas that fueled a lot of the Mexican manufacturing. And now that Mexican manufacturing may be slowing down, Texas gas imports to Mexico may also slow down. And so this is going to be something that's going to have an effect on both sides of the border. So we should expect the industry to be quite a bit in trouble, and certainly here in Texas where we're sitting. A couple of other questions that I think are important. You mentioned the peso in Mexico. I mean, it is about 25 to 1 now. There's been a devaluation of 25 to 30% because of the coronavirus crisis. And you're right, it may actually make Mexico more competitive because there'll be more pesos to your dollar. So to speak. And so a lot of companies will feel like this is a good time to invest in Mexico. It may take a while to do so. But there's a couple of things that I would like you to sort of talk about. One is, of course, that also means inflation in Mexico because so many of its own consumption depends on imports. And that means Mexico will have to acquire those more expensively. So that will add inflationary pressure in the Mexican economy, and so I think that's one thing to speculate. How do you think that is going to pan out? And of course, can you talk a little bit about Mr. Lopez Obrador's own fight with the private sector and his unwillingness to offer tax deferments, tax breaks, and other incentives to keep their factories and their businesses going? Which may also disincentivize investment, at least in the short term.
I think all of those are very relevant questions. Starting with your last point, I think many in Mexico and certainly some of their buyers in the United States have been very unhappy to see the lack of sympathy that the administration has for businesses, including a lot of relatively small businesses as well, which seems rather foolish to me, since particularly if you want some of these businesses to give some compensation to the workers they have furloughed, you better help them with cash flow, and you're not doing that. It just doesn't seem very logical. I mean, I think what the U.S. Congress passed a couple of weeks ago is far from perfect, but at least it makes some effort to do that kind of thing. And one of the things we're seeing in the U.S., and I assume it's similar in Mexico, is if you have auto factories shut down, they get UAW has funds, the auto companies have funds. What about the smaller auto manufacturers in the U.S. or Mexico? they're probably laying off people and they're not being compensated at all, or they'll be compensated only by unemployment insurance. And in the US at the moment, it's almost impossible to get through to the unemployment insurance offices. So a lot of people that aren't getting anything yet. There is money from the bailout fund, but in some cases, it'll take people 3 or 4 months to get their checks. So we have a problem here, just as there is one in Mexico. I just think it's probably more of a problem in Mexico. Remind me of your first question again.
It was about the peso and the inflationary pressures on Mexico.
Certainly, there's an inflationary pressure. If you go back long ago to December of 1994. When the peso was devalued by Zedillo, he had no choice, by about 3 to 1. It was a huge impact on Mexican workers because they were getting this pay the same in peso, but it wouldn't buy anything. And companies that had trusted workers essentially went in and compensated them particularly extra amounts so they wouldn't lose them. I'm assuming that something similar. I mean, it's not going to be 3 times what it was, but something similar here is going to be a major problem, and there will be some Mexican companies who have to come up with their own funds to be able to take care at least of their more trusted workers. And we don't know where it's going to stop. I think 2 days ago it was 25.9. I think it's come up a little bit in the last day or two. And for some industries, agriculture, for example, this lowers the dollar cost. But if people aren't buying the usual agricultural products because restaurants are all closed, that won't help you. And if you're making, again, my favorite product, television sets, a lot of those parts are coming from China or elsewhere, or Korea or elsewhere in Asia. And those are all have to be paid for by their manufacturers in dollars. So that offsets the advantage of the devaluation. So I think in this particular case, particularly when you have a recession or a depression coming, or maybe already here, or at least a recession, if there's not any demand in the US, the benefit to the companies is not going to be that substantial because they're not going to be able to maintain production, even sales, even and exports, even with, relatively speaking, lower prices in pesos, plus the pain that it's going to give to the rest of the economy, particularly the workers, is going to be extreme.
In the case of Texas, I think it's important to also consider, David, I wonder what your thoughts are on this, the issue that besides a slowdown in gas exports, potentially, if manufacturing in Mexico slows down substantially, which is a real impact on Texas, there's also another impact. We know a few days ago, I guess, maybe about a week ago, 10 days ago, trade per se had not yet slowed down. But we know that the logistics of trade, trucks, warehouses, and so on, depend on the factory supply that then gets into the logistics and the distribution chains. There was some speculation that a lot of the trade had not slowed down because it was existing inventory that was still kind of moving across the border and getting into the United States. But if Mexican factories slow down quite a bit, those inventories are going to run out, and that's going to be a crunch on the logistics, warehousing, distribution industry in Texas and California and beyond. How soon do you think, if you have any idea, this might happen, and what's the impact, and how long will it take eventually for those supplies, those inventories, to rise up again and then get back in the chain? I mean, that means that the crisis may be a little bit more prolonged than we think.
I think it's going to vary, probably depending a lot on the sectors. My guess is most of the auto companies in America and in North America are just delighted to be closed down, because nobody's going to buy the cars and they're not worried about it. And they're quite convinced that in a couple of months, if they need to ramp up production, they can do so. So maybe they are also doing some inventory building in, let's say, in Detroit or in Central Ohio, if you're Honda. So I think that's probably a factor as well. We have seen a number of stories here in the last few days about the impact on the long-haul trucking business. People, particularly the owner-operators, which is a very big part of the industry, both in coming across the border into the U.S. And within the U.S., they're having trouble getting getting full loads. They take a load from, say, Chicago to Los Angeles, but they can't get anything to come back. So their business is down very significantly. And I think the ripple effect is, it probably isn't affecting the railroads as much as China trade is, but certainly to some extent it is. And certainly since most of the U.S. Mexico trade moves by truck, the impact on the trucking industry has been enormous. The impact on the fresh produce industry, particularly in Nogales, which is where most of it comes across the border, servicing, warehousing, trucking, all of those issues has already begun to be significant. And I know there's some pipeline here, but at some point, whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, the pipeline is probably going to run dry or very shallow. And again, it won't be uniform. In some product areas, maybe even some auto parts rather than others, they will run out before they do in other places. But of course, if you're making something that has lots of parts, whether it's autos or television sets or something else, as soon as you start missing a few parts, your assembly line shuts down. So I think the impact, will probably be seeing the impact rather significantly, I would guess, in a lot of industries before the end of April. And if this all goes on for another month or so after that, in many parts of the US and in Mexico, then the impact, I think, is going to be a lot more severe. And again, it's many service workers in Texas, in Arizona, in Mexico, and as far away as California or New York as well. I mean, nobody's buying a lot of consumer goods except for food in a place like New York City at the moment. Everything, or drugstores, everything else is closed down. What does that mean for all of the service people that are sending, blue jeans or other clothing from Mexico to Chicago? It means they're getting very badly hurt.
David, I have a kind of a political science question. I'll come back to it in a minute. It has to do with the elections, but I wanted to ask you a question. Is it recommendable now that the USMCA be postponed, the implementation of it? It certainly introduces a lot more uncertainty on how business is going to be done, what new regulations. It takes time to do that. That will certainly constitute a process that has to take place after it enters into effect. Is it better to just have the certainty of NAFTA today, leave it in place for another 6 months or a year and so on, and give some period of adjustment? And is it recommendable that Mr. Trump really reconsider his tariffs?
First question, I don't see any downside for most of the stakeholders in postponing USMCA for 3 months, because it just means that NAFTA stays in force for 3 months longer. I doubt you're not going to see a postponement for a year. Whether it's longer than 3 months depends on how things develop. But the huge advantage for business, which means for their workers as well as themselves, is that everybody knows what the rules are. It's been in force for 26, 27 years and no change. As soon as it goes into force, things are going to start changing, particularly in some of the nitty-gritty areas like new types of certificates of origin, new auto rules of origin, particularly at a time when there aren't any regulations for the auto industry to operate on, particularly for things like the $16 an hour rule and the higher steel and aluminum content rule. So you're going to be forcing on certain industries, and we keep focusing on autos because that's about 25% or more of total trade in autos and auto parts, and it's one of the more complicated areas to deal with in rules of origin. So to ask a bunch of companies that at the moment are closed down to be ready to gear up in 2 months or so, or 2.5 months for a total new set of rules, it seems to me is unreasonable. And that of course is what they're saying. And that of course is what their congressmen and senators are saying as well. So if you could come up with a really big downside, then I would say, well, maybe you should reconsider. But there really isn't a big downside. The area where there is most uncertainty, and it seems to me, is how quickly are the new labor provisions in USMCA, in Mexican law, and in the US implementing legislation going to be implemented. Now, they're supposed to be ready to go as of July 1 with these new consuls and some new funding at the US Labor Department. But again, I don't think anybody really believes that the changes in the labor relations in collective bargaining are going to take place overnight. It's going to be, under the best of circumstances, we're talking 3, 6, 9, 12 months, and maybe a lot longer. And I think the pressure among a lot of working groups in Mexico, even those who would be most interested in getting these new provisions implemented are going to be the impetus to do that is going to be chilled if they're being laid off, or at least they're risking being laid off, or they think that the additional issues would be there. So eventually, some of these companies are going to have higher costs, but I would frankly be surprised if there's a lot of pressure for that in the next few months or even this year.
I have a question. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and they have to do with the U.S. elections. What do you think the impact of all this will be? Obviously, they're asking us to speculate. Some of us are more political science. You're a lawyer, and so on. But still, I think it's important to figure out or try to figure out what this is going to happen. And then once you say something about the U.S. election, I'll say something about the Mexican election and what I think may happen.
Needless to say, this is not my field. I'm like many other American citizens who are speculating on whether or not this whole mess and the way it's been handled by the administration is going to be a significant factor in November. And the answer is, I don't think we really know yet. What has changed? Sanders withdrew today. So basically Biden has a more or less clear shot. Will that help him a lot? I don't know. Who will the vice president be? What other factors will be there? Again, if you look at the polls, which I always distrust, a very substantial, half the country at least, thinks that the Trump administration, under the circumstances, is doing a reasonably good job. Now, will they still feel that way a month from now if there are 50, 60, 70, 100,000 Americans have died? Who knows? But I've long since giving up trying to speculate on at what point a large number of Trump supporters are no longer going to be Trump supporters. I don't think that's going to happen under any conceivable conditions. So I don't know what the impact is going to be. I worry more about the impact on denying some people, some groups, the right to vote. I think particularly what we saw happen in Wisconsin yesterday, with forcing an in-person election when it very easily could have been postponed for a week and done all by mail, is a good indication of how much pressure there is in some states to make it harder for people to vote. I would worry more, I think, about that than I would about the direct impact of the way the administration handles the coronavirus, particularly if things manage to muddle along for another month or so till you get lots of tests. I mean, you're not going to have. I don't think you're going to have any vaccine for a very long time. I don't think that malaria medicine is going to turn out to be the wonder drug for coronavirus. But it may well be that within 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or less, that we will seem to have turned the corner, at least to the extent that China seems to have turned the corner, although I don't know how much you can believe what you hear from China. And again, we're 6 months away from the election. So who knows? If we're in the middle of a deep recession, I think that hurts the incumbent president, whoever he might be. If it looks like things are getting significantly better, then many people, I suspect, will give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I'll say something about the, the Mexican election, because I think there really aren't elections this year. I'm talking about the 2021 election. Mexico is about 14 months away from a midterm election in which the House of Congress will be up for grabs. And of course, the lower house, not the Senate. And of course, half of the governorships and lots of different positions throughout the country will be up for election. We know one thing, and that is that Mr. López Obrador has proven to be quite stubborn. His program to fight this pandemic economically, which was announced on Sunday, March 31st, I think, about a week, maybe a week and a half ago, when he gave an important speech on that, is essentially doubling down on his path, which is spending on Pemex, taking money from other places, spending on Pemex, very little additional money for health, which was already down with an under expenditure of 60% last year. And of course, his pet projects, which is the Mayan train, the Dos Bocas refinery, which increasingly looks like an unviable, but also kind of a foolish project, because it's this is not the time to invest in a refinery when there's so much refining capacity on both sides of the border and so on. So it seems to be somewhat of a problem. And of course, his alternative airport around Mexico City. So he's got several of these projects, and he's saying that all the money is going to go to those projects and to Pemex and to rescue Pemex. Well, it's not going to give in, especially if revenues fall, trade is falling, jobs are being lost, and of course there is inflationary pressures, and there's no stimulus, there's no counter-cyclical stimulus. So I think there is a mismanagement. And of course, what we see in Mr. AMLO is interesting because everybody in the world, Europe and Japan and China and the US, are choosing to inject cash, liquidity into the economy to sort of prop it up and prepare it for recovery. Mr. Lopez Obrador is going the other way. So he's testing a very different formula than all other countries or most other countries are testing, and we'll see which of these experiments succeeds. But that's going to be quite a big issue. I wanted to ask you, what do you, in the beginning, you sort of talked about some of these things that are going to be kind of temporary changes, and some of them that are going to be more structural changes. Where do you anticipate some of these things to sort of pop back up as soon as this is over? Kind of a quick recovery, a reestablishment of prior activity, and what do you see really substantial, potentially substantial structural changes to economic activity in the binational context?
Certainly, I think some of it, as I suggested, is going to be in anything related to internet. I think Amazon.com and to some extent Walmart online are going to come out of this stronger than ever. And I think some of their competitors who have already been seriously weakened, whether it's Macy's or Gap or JCPenney, or God forbid, Sears, will be even worse off than before. I think despite the fact that money is very, very cheap in the United States, it's very easy to borrow. I think there's great skepticism generally in the investment community that a lot of these bricks and mortar stores and many smaller stores, certainly the strip centers in Tucson, for example, are doing very, very badly. Some of them were doing badly well before coronavirus, even with a very strong economy here. And I'm guessing that some of those are never going to come back easy. Now, obviously, you can't buy groceries entirely online. People don't want to go to restaurants or movies or football games or soccer games online. You can't do any of those things. So there's some industries I think will come back. I think there's a huge love in the U.S. of basketball and football, and increasingly Mexican football, soccer, and of course in Mexico as well, and Europe and most other parts of the world. I think professional sports will come back as soon as it's safe to do so, and probably in the U.S. college sports as well, because it's such a huge part of our culture. Those are areas which I think will recover, whether it's 3 months or 6 months. There's a big disagreement between California's government and the president about whether the NFL season is going to start at the end of August. But it will happen. No, there's no question it's going to come back. The market, the food market issue is another one, and I think consumer confidence, even with low interest rates, and of course those low interest rates don't go to your credit card, is going to be severely damaged for several years, even if the U.S. economy is out of recession by mid 2021 or late 2021. I think it will be 2 or 3 years before consumer spending, automobile buying, vacation travel, things of that sort, even restaurant meals, recover fully in the U.S. Mexico, you're much better able to speculate than I am. But again, if I'm correct, tourism will come back in Mexico sooner than a lot of other things. And that means hotels and restaurants and the beaches and all of those things, because Americans really, really love to go to Mexico. But I think there will be some who are going to be very badly hurt financially over the next 5 or 6 months, who simply aren't going to have any money for discretionary spending. Even when the economy starts to recover, it will take a long time before they have the confidence and the funds to be able to do the kind of things they would like to do.
Yeah, a couple of things, David, I think are important to think about. One is, if Mexican produce slows down And as you mentioned, most of it comes through Sonora into Arizona and from there to the rest of the markets. If that slows down and production in Mexico sort of is in a crunch, the logistics is simply not there. The border is almost impossible to cross, and we know that this is perishable products. Should we expect to see then an inflationary pressure on vegetables and fruits that come from Mexico? And for example, I don't know what the percentages are in tomato and lettuce and a lot of other produce. And then people are going to begin to see it in the prices at the stores, that those particular goods, avocados and so on that come from Mexico are just simply going to be out of the reach of a lot of people in the US for a while.
I'm not sure. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, and I suspect it will be very product specific, as I suggested from what I've read, what I've seen. A lot of the demand for Mexican produce is by restaurants, and that's way down. So maybe the demand is going to go down as well as the supply, and I don't know how that is going to work itself out. Most, Mexican tomatoes in the U.S. come from three places. They come from Florida, they come from Canada, and they come from Mexico, with Mexico being the most. I don't know what the impact is in Florida, but it will be significant as well because there's a lot of hand labor and there as well. There seems to be more concern in the U.S. that vegetable and fruit prices will rise because we do not have enough farm workers to harvest the crops. It's harder for them to come across the border. Obviously, 70% of them are undocumented. Anyway, this is not just a problem in the U.S. It's a problem in the U.K. It's a problem in lots of parts of Europe. So I think there probably will be inflationary pressure on food prices in some sectors, but I suspect it's going to come more from the U.S. suppliers than from the Mexican suppliers. That's just
here's an interesting question from one of our listeners as well. He says, my company owns and operates a manufacturing facility in Mexico. It's not a maquila, and not all factories in Mexico are maquiladoras. That's a very specific type of outsourcing that occurs, especially along the border. But there are actually factories that operate in Mexico. From where they manufacture goods that are then that support U.S., Canada, and Mexico activities. With the confusion created as to which industry is critical in Mexico, and I think Mr. Lopez Obrador has not been very clear on what industries are critical and therefore deserve protection. In fact, it's almost denied almost all protections. These companies are finding themselves in a situation where they may have to stop operations. And yet in the U.S., it's been the opposite. Some of these industries are being labeled, essential, such as power, utilities, and others. So any suggestions you may have as to how to manage these different scenarios about what's essential, what's not essential, and what is an absolute and necessary recommendation for all these factories, but governments rather, to consider essential. What is essential? How to figure out what is essential and should not be stopped? I mean, should manufacturing and distribution and such be also considered essential in both countries?
I think part of the problem in the U.S. is much of this is still, even though there's a Defense Production Act, much of it is still being determined by state governors. So you have different rules on factory closings, for example, from Pennsylvania compared to Arizona. So I think that's part of the problem. I would guess that if this company is producing essential parts for electric power, that is obviously an issue of national concern. And I suppose it's either going to be Peter Navarro's office of the White House or Mnuchin, the Treasury Department, that is going to have, basically somebody is going to, at some point, not only in this sector, but I'm guessing in dozens of other sectors, there are going to have to be some conversations between the US and Mexico, maybe between Canada and the US as well, to say, well, we have to have this stuff, so we need you to be more flexible here, or we need you to grant a waiver. I assume it's possible. The question is, things are not exactly clear as to where the lines of responsibility are in the U.S. federal government. So I'm not exactly sure where you go, but I guess I would start with Navarro's office.
And I can tell you that if there is such a problem in the United States, that institutionally is much better structured. In Mexico, certainly it's even a greater problem, because I don't think that the Lopez Obrador administration has any agreement as to what is essential for the country, I think. And he's picked a fight with the entrepreneurial class in Mexico. He sort of said there's not going to be any rescues, there's not going to be any package, any tax breaks, any kind of thing like that for them. And in fact, there's a lot of kind of poisonous rhetoric against the private sector in Mexico. And so a lot of these companies are beginning to sort of bind together in their different chambers to try to figure out what their response is going to be, given the government's not just absence, but outright hostility to investors and business owners and certainly the private sector in general. So I think that's going to be a big issue in Mexico. There's a very quick question about riots, food riots and things like that. Are we going to get to that point? We know that in Mexico, some people are binding together, organizing online to go and do looting in different stores and so on. It seems that the Mexico state and the Mexico City governments cracked down on that. And it seems that the numbers are down. But if this lasts much longer, can we expect also some social unrest and riots and such things, such protests against the government? Or do you think it's something that can be anticipated, contained, and dealt with in advance? And I don't mean by police force. I mean by governments taking action to ensure that everyone has what they need.
Well, if we're talking about the U.S., I think from what I have seen, the problems with our supermarkets and running out of toilet paper, for example, are more in getting the goods into the markets than they are to the supplies of goods overall, whether it's food or paper products or something else. In Arizona, they brought out a few people from the National Guard to help stock supermarket shelves. That's where the problem is, or at least appears that the problem is. Now, if this goes on another month or 2 months, who knows? I see more of a problem of people who have been laid off and who have not got their $1,200 check from the government, and they're not getting unemployment insurance because the state unemployment insurance offices in most of these significantly affected states are simply overwhelmed, but it's taking them forever to go through the process. So is it possible to have food riots or civil unrest in the U.S.? Of course it is, particularly if it goes on well into the summer and into the fall. But my guess is it probably won't happen, at least not in any very broad sense. And with Mexico, I have no idea.
Great. Well, I think we've crossed the 1 hour mark. I think this is an evolving situation. Obviously, these things are still happening as we already discussed. There are many different sectors that are being affected, from energy to logistics to manufacturing to the actual supply chain, down to the supermarkets, down to the stores, and of course to people's tables. So this is a discussion that will continue. David and I will join you again, hopefully in a couple of weeks, to have another conversation as things evolve and try to read what the future might bring. David, any concluding thoughts you might have?
No, it obviously is very much an uncertain and ongoing process, but it's going to be important to all of us.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us in this webinar. At the Center for the United States and Mexico, we continue to keep our finger on the pulse of what is going on today on trade, on security, on the border, on energy, and a lot of other issues that concern Mexico and the binational relationship. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you.